we are in 2025 celebrating the 80th anniversary since the end of World War II in 1945. And when future historians look at our time in the last 80 years, at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge that we have created overall a better world for humanity. A lot of us, and certainly we in East Asia, have prospered as a result of a world order that the West gifted to us in 1945. That world order has served us very well. But the reality is that that world order is now under threat. And what I hope to do is to explain to you where the threat comes from and what we need to do about it. And I'll try to divide my remarks into three parts. In part one, I want to explain how the world has changed so dramatically. And these dramatic changes, of course, mean that we have to change the world order. And then in part two, I'll explain where the resistance to this change is coming from. And then in part three, hopefully suggest why it would be wiser for those who are resisting this change to avoid doing so. So let me begin with part one and to talk just to illustrate to you with a few statistics of how much the world has changed fundamentally, especially in terms of the shift of power, as Cheng was saying in his remarks earlier, the shift of power from the West to the East. Now, I give you three examples which will illustrate how dramatic the shift of power has been. First, I'll compare the European Union with China. In 1980, 45 years ago, the combined economy of the EU was 10 times larger than China. 10 times. Today, EU and China are about the same size. By 2050, EU will be half the size of China. I want to emphasize one point. This kind of massive structural shift in one human lifetime of 70 years, where the European Union goes from being 10 times larger to becoming half the size in 70 years, these kinds of structural shifts don't happen very often. And because they are happening now, the pressure for change becomes very real. But let me give you two other examples. The second one, I'll compare the United Kingdom and India. And this is a good comparison to make. Just remember, 100 years ago, quite remarkably, 100 years ago, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. I mean, looking back now, it's quite stunning that that happened. I mean, just imagine today the British Prime Minister sending 100,000 Englishmen to run India today. They'd be massacred, right? But that happened 100 years ago. But I can tell you, even as recently as 1990, 35 years ago, the British GDP was still 4 times larger than that of India, right? But last year, India surpassed the British to have a larger economy, and by 2050, India will be 4 times the size of the British, right? Look at that. In 1980, the British were 4 times bigger than India. By 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than the UK. A major fundamental shift. And let me give you a third example, because everyone knows the China story, everyone knows the India story. I'm glad you mentioned ASEAN, Cheng. But ASEAN has also done remarkably well. As recently as 2000, Germany, which is the industrial powerhouse of Europe, was 3 times bigger than ASEAN. By last year or this year, Germany and ASEAN are about the same size. And by 2050, Germany will be half the size of ASEAN. Again, in barely 50 years, Germany goes from being 3 times bigger they're becoming half the size of ASEAN. So these are, you can see, therefore, there has been a massive shift of power in the world. So when such massive shifts of power happen, the logical thing to do, the rational thing to do, is to adapt our world order, adapt international organizations to deal with the different world. Unfortunately, that is not happening. So in part 2 of my remarks, I hope to speak about where the resistance is coming from. And it's a deep resistance. Now, I'm going to speak about the West, broadly speaking, but you'll be surprised that I'm going to give a bit more emphasis on the European Union rather than the United States, because overall, one of the remarkable things about the United States is that it has basically kept the size of its GNP in the world relatively constant, which is, I must say, quite an amazing achievement by the United States. Around 2000, it was 25% of the world's GNP. Today, it's still around 25% of the world's GDP. So the United States has been changing, adapting, growing in its own, as you know, unusual ways. And everyone thinks that when you talk about the world order, you must talk about the threats posed by President Donald Trump and his tariffs and so on and so forth. And of course, all those things are disrupting the world. But at the end of the day, it's the structural adjustments that have to be made that are more important than the temporary tariffs that you see problem. You can get very distracted by the issue of Trump and tariffs, but by so doing, you're not paying attention to the deeper structural challenges that have to be dealt with. And here, in terms of structural changes, since power has shifted away from Europe very clearly, it's Europe's resistance to change in international organizations that has become, in some ways, the biggest problem in terms of adapting to a new world. And just to give you, let me illustrate that point with 2 examples. The first is, of course, in theory, the world's most powerful international economic organization, which is the IMF. And it's interesting that if you go to the IMF website, and my research assistants found this, and this is what the IMF website says. In the IMF's own fact sheet on how it makes decisions, it claims that, quote, voting power and decision-making at the IMF reflect its member countries' relative economic position. Let me repeat that. This is what the IMF says. Voting power and decision-making at the IMF reflect its member countries' relative economic position. And then it goes on to say the IMF works to ensure that its governance structure keeps pace with changes in the world economy, including the larger role that emerging market and developing countries now have, unquote. So it's very clear that the IMF honestly admits that voting structure must reflect the new economic balance of power in the world. Now, I already told you that the EU and China's share today of global GNP is about the same, at 17%. And therefore, the IMF voting share of the EU should be 17%, and the IMF voting share of China should be 17%. Guess what the numbers are? The Europe share of IMF voting structure is 26% instead of 17%, and China's share is 6% instead of 17%. So even though the IMF website says clearly voting shares reflect a country's share of global economic power, that's not shown. And the reason why the change doesn't happen is because the European countries have done a brilliant job of fighting this incredible resistance, creating this incredible resistance to change in very artful little ways of ensuring that the voting shares don't keep up with the new order. And so that's one example of resistance to change. Now, if the IMF is the, incidentally, I'm not the only person who says this. I came across a quote recently by a Brazilian economist, Paulo Batista Jr., who's, by the way, a former executive director at the IMF. And in a recent report, he said, quote, "European resistance to reform is a long-standing, intractable problem at the root of a large part of the IMF's increasingly legitimacy problems. Europe makes at most partial or even only verbal concessions on these matters." So this European resistance to change has been noted and documented by lots of other people too. Now the second example I was going to give, if the IMF is the most powerful international economic organization, the most powerful international political organization by far is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the only international body that has the power to make decisions that are binding and mandatory on all member states of the UN. So in a sense, that's where the real power is. And for those of you who have been familiar with my writings on the UN, you know that I've also discussed the UN Security Council at great length. And in theory, the UN Security Council has got 15 members, the 5 permanent member states, P5 of US, Russia, China, UK, France, and the 10 other elected members. But I can tell you that after Singapore spent 2 years in the UN Security Council, and I was the Singapore ambassador to the UN, when I left the UN Security Council, I came to the conclusion that the UN Security Council has got 5 members and 10 observers. And the 10 observers were treated. And by the way, one of the French ambassadors was very honest about it. When Singapore tried to propose some changes in the working methods of the UN Security Council to try and improve the Security Council, the French ambassador said, "Why are these tourists trying to change the furniture in our living room?" Which is very honest, I must say. But that reality is that it's the 5 permanent members who run the UN Security Council. Now, what's interesting about this composition of these 5 permanent members is that in theory, the 5 permanent members are supposed to represent the great powers of the day. And there's no doubt in 1945, the 5 great powers of the day were United States, then Soviet Union, China, UK, and France. But this is 2025. And you've already seen how the British economy has shrunk, how the French economy has also shrunk relative to the rest of the world, but they still remain permanent members of the UN Security Council resisting change. And this is a story I got to know very well because the UN actually set up something called the Open-Ended Working Group on UN Security Council reform in 1993, I think. And we are now in 2025. 32 years have gone by, nothing has changed. So someone said, let's change the name of the working group from Open-Ended Working Group on UN Security Council Reform to Never-Ending UN Security Group Reform. This is a serious suggestion. But I can tell you, incidentally, unless you've been in the trenches, and I have been actually in the trenches, fighting these issues of trying to reform international organizations, you have no idea how brilliant the Europeans are at fighting change. Brilliant. Because what they will say up front is that, of course, we are for change. Yes, we are for change. But behind the scenes, they know exactly what levers to pull, what to do to ensure that change doesn't happen. And so you have this rather crazy situation whereby, like UK, Europe, for example, as I mentioned earlier, now has 17% of the global GNP, but in terms of permanent membership seats, they have 40% because UK and France make up 2/5 of the 5 permanent members. And that's why I wrote an article in the Financial Times last year, and I'm actually genuinely surprised the Financial Times published it. It shows you how open-minded the Financial Times is. I said that, clearly, I gave you the data already, how India's economy is now larger than the British. By 2050, it'll be 4 times bigger than the British. So the British, perhaps as a nice act of atonement for the colonization of India, should voluntarily give up their permanent membership seat to India. And that's actually, I'm glad you laugh, because it sounds funny, but it is actually a serious suggestion. Because Britain today represents a country of the past. India represents a country of the future. And the past must give way to the future. And some of you must have noticed in the recent column by Martin Wolf on the state of his own country, UK, I'll never forget the first line of his column. The first line of his column said, the UK has failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. Failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. So why are you clinging on to permanent membership? Why not give way? Right? That's the rational, logical thing to do. But sadly, it is not happening. So in the 5 minutes that I have left, I'm going to try and explain why we should work to persuade the Europeans that it's actually in Europe's interest to make way for other powers in many of these key international organizations. Because at the end of the day, the most important fact that the West should realize is that if you look at the world's population, there are 8 billion people in the world, only 12% live in the West. 88% live in the rest. And we are now, as everyone understands, we live in a small, interdependent, shrinking world, right? In fact, Kofi Annan very aptly compared it to a global village. Now, if you are living in a small, densely interconnected global village, and you're 12% of the population, it's in your interest as a minority to ensure that the village is well run, is stable, and not chaotic, right? So you want to have a village council that is functioning well. And what's interesting is that it is, at the end of the day, is the West, and certainly Europe, that taught the world that when you want to have village councils, the best village councils are the democratic village councils, where people vote. And so the village council must represent the village as a whole and not represent a minority. And this is, at the end of the day, the biggest paradox about our time. Because domestically, the Western countries preach the virtues of democracy, stunningly. Democracy is the best way of running a society. But when it comes to the global village, please don't speak about democracy. Don't ask for any allocation of power on the basis of our share of global population. We want to keep our privileged seats. And you can see that contradiction there very clearly. And that contradiction also means that they're laying the seeds for trouble that is coming. Because if the Global Village Council, at the end of the day, doesn't represent the views of the majority of the population of the world, they can become irrelevant. And so I've always said, having served on the UN Security Council, that the UN Security Council is going to face a major dilemma. And the dilemma is quite simple. You can keep your composition with British and French as permanent members, and you lose your credibility. But if you want to keep your credibility, then you've got to change your composition. That's the dilemma. And the obvious solution is the credibility of the UN Security Council is much more important than its composition. So bring in the new powers, and certainly bring in the powers that are rising. So I hope that as a result of our discussion today, we can work together and try to persuade the West that the world has changed. Let us all adapt to this change. Thank you very much.